Today's daf we're going to learn is Gittin, daf Dalet. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with a quick review of what we did yesterday. We saw yesterday that we were struggling with who is the tanna of our Mishna who says that if somebody brings a get from abroad, they have to say, Bifanai nechtavu, bifanai nechtam. Before me it was signed, before me it was written, and before me it was signed. Meaning, now we have this big debate, Raba and Rava. What is the reason for that? That we discussed already, which we're going to get back to today. Is it because we want to make sure we won't have witnesses around to check because it comes from a far distance? Or is it because we want to make sure that it was done lishma? So according to Rabba, who says, remember hey at the end of Rabba's name and hey at the end of the word lishma, that's how we remember. According to Rabba, who says the issue is lishma, that has to be written in the name specifically for him and for her. It sounds like befanai nechtam, ubefanai nechtav, or I should say nechtav and nechtam. It was written and it was signed, meaning that the witness has to say, the person who brings it, the messenger has to say, I know it was written lishma and it was signed lishma. Now, who is the tanna who needs both writing and signing lishma? We have Rabbi Meir on the one hand, who says, Ede chatima karte. The main part is the witnesses who sign on the get. That's what makes the get the get. Therefore, the chatima has to be lishma, but we already saw the writing doesn't have to be lishma. Then we have Rabbi Elazar on the other hand, who said the main thing is Ede mesira karte, is the passing on of the get. That's what's the important part, that we have witnesses witnessing the husband giving the get to the wife. The witnesses signed are not so important, which means that when the Torah says v'katav l'sefer krichut, it must be referring to the writing. The writing has to be lishma. So one needs signing, one needs writing. Neither needs both. So we ended yesterday's daf after we had a suggestion that maybe it's Rabbi Elazar and we rejected it. And then we have another suggestion that, and I have this charted on the sheet, the opinion of Rabbi Elazar from yesterday. Just go up to the top here. And then the opinion of Rabbi Meir also from yesterday, that perhaps when Rabbi Meir says k'tiva lishma, that you only need that you don't need it to be written lishma, maybe Pilo by Rabbi Meir, third line from the bottom of Daf Gimel Amud Bet, k'tiva lishma midoraita midiraban and bai. Maybe though he does need it on a rabbinic level, and that's what we suggested. But v'ham Rav Nachman, it can't be that he also needs it to be written lishma on a rabbinic level. In other words, the chatima lishma, the signing, has to be lishma on a Torah level. On a rabbinic level, also the writing, because it can't be, because Omer haya ahama Rav Nachman says, Omer haya Rabbi Meir, afilu mitzao ba'ashpa, v'chatmu v'natnu la kashir. Okay, this is going to be rejected as well. Why? Because Rav Nachman says that Rabbi Meir said that if you find it in a garbage, now, I'm a man, I find a get with my name on it, and my wife's name on it in the garbage, I can take it and give it to her. As long as I get witnesses signed on it. That means this was definitely not written for me. I found it in the garbage. But as long as it was signed, v'natnula, and I give it to her, kashel, because the signing is what's important. Now, maybe this one, Rav Nachman quoted Rabbi Meir saying this. Maybe he meant only on a Torah level, Rabbi Meir says this, but on a rabbinic level, right? You would need, this wouldn't work. Well, then, it should have said, Omer haya Rabbi Meir, on a Torah level. This would work, but on a rabbinic level, it wouldn't, right? It doesn't make any sense. They would work on a rabbinic level. It wouldn't work on a rabbinic level. And this source basically says that Rabbi Meir says it's fine. It wouldn't work on a rabbinic level. Again, you would have to say on a Torah level, this would work. So that can't be. So let's go back. So those were two options. We saw one yesterday and this other one that we started yesterday and now finished today, that neither of them work. Now we're going to go back and try to suggest. We're going to have two suggestions now that are actually going to work. These are on the second chart on the study guide. Rabbi Elazar. Really, it is Rabbi Elazar. B'chilo by Rabbi Elazar chatima. Now, Rabbi Elazar doesn't need chatima lishma. So what are we going to say? That's only hechadeleka edim klal. That's if you have no witnesses at all. In other words, if husband gives the get to his wife with two witnesses that give the get to her, there's no signatures on the get, no problem. That works as long as you have two edim. So perfect. But that's when there's no edim at all. But edim. But if there are witnesses who signed on the document, then by. Well, the signatures, if there are, the signatures have to be lishma. This is where usually people say less is more. If you don't even have signatures, then you don't need it to be lishma because the signatures aren't important at all. You don't even need them. But once they're there, they have to be real. And what does it mean, real? Lishma. He's going to need it lishma if they actually are in existence. Well, then they have to have been signed for this person, right? And for the man and for this woman. So how are we going to prove that Rabbi Elazar holds this way? The Amar Rabbi Abba, as Rabbi Abba says, Modeh Rabbi Elazar, we're going to have a similar case where he says Rabbi Elazar agrees or admits, like to the other side, b'mezuyaf mitocho pasul. If it's a forged document, he's going to agree that it's disqualified, meaning if the signatures are problematic. Okay, what way? For example, if, let's say, my get document has a witness signed that's my brother. Okay, he can't be a good witness. So now, Rabbi Elazar says, as long as my husband gave me the get in front of two witnesses, it's not a problem. But if my brother is signed on the document, it ruins my get. No good. Because if it's messed up, there's something wrong with it. If the Eidim were related to each other, if the Eidim were related to one of the people, if the Eidim were people who are generally considered, we know them to be not kosher witnesses. There's all sorts of categories of people that aren't kosher witnesses, robbers, things like that. Then even Rabbi Elazar agrees it's ruined. So that's a good example. It's just like ours. Whereas if you have the signatures, they have to be done right. They have to be lishma. It's just, so that's why when our Mishna would be a case where there happen to be signatures, even though Rabbi Elazar doesn't require them. But if there are, then the person who brings it says it was written and it was signed lishma. Okay, it's a little bit complicated, but it's a possible answer. Comes Rav Ashi, though, and brings a super simple answer. So our whole question is, which tanna does the Mishna match? Well, Rav Ashi Amal, Hamani, Rabbi Yehuda. Rav Ashi says, our Mishna is Rabbi Yehuda. Wait, who's Rabbi Yehuda? We didn't hear about him. We heard about Rabbi Meir. We heard about Rabbi Elazar. Where do we get Rabbi Yehuda from? Well, it's not as it says in the following Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda posel, this is on Daf Kaf Aleph. Rabbi Yehuda posel ad shetehe ktivato v'chatimato betalush. Remember, we had that whole thing about attached to the ground, detached from the ground, etc. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and he says, you can't write it or sign it when it's attached to the ground. The whole thing has to be done when it's detached from the ground because the writing and the signature are critical. There you have it. Obviously, it's him. He's the one who requires both chatima and ktiva lishma. Both the writing and the signature have to be lishma. So now the Gemara asks the obvious question. Why didn't we say this in the first place? A much easier answer. So now the Gemara explains why we were trying so hard to figure it out, either according to Rabbi Meir or according to Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Meir, Hadran and Rabbi Meir, they were trying to figure it out according to Rabbi Meir, the stam nitin Rabbi Meir, because stam Mishna follows Rabbi Meir. So if we have a stam Mishna, it means a Mishna unattributed to any one person. Generally, it's Rabbi Meir. So it would make sense if we could try to figure it out according to Rabbi Meir. That's our first default option always. But that didn't work. Mahadrina de Rabbi Elazar. We tried Rabbi Elazar. Why? Dekaimalan, and this is a very important line. Hilchata kavate b'gitin. The rule of thumb is we hold like Rabbi Elazar when it comes to Gittin. This means, and Tosfot talks about this, very famous Tosfot here, one of the most famous Tosfots that exist. Tosfot says, Kaimalan halachak Rabbi Elazar b'Gittin. That means that we hold Edim Mesira Karte. In the end, the most important part is the witnesses giving over the get. Okay, not the signatures. Now, okay, it's not just Tosfot who says this, but Tosfot in the middle of the Tosfot here says a few very important words. He basically says, Lafichach, I'm like 5 lines down in Tosfot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, toward the end of the line. Lafichach tzarich lizaher shiyu edei mesira b'shat netinat haget. Therefore, because we hold like Rabbi Elazar and Gittin, you must make sure there's witnesses that see the get being given to the woman. De'inu karte, because that's what makes the get the get. Okay, she's not divorced if there's no Eidei Mesira, even if there's witnesses signed. Now we're going to get to a very famous Mishnah later in the Masechet, which gets us off on it about, there's all sorts of things that we do because of Tikkun Olam. One of them is the Eidim sign on the get Mishum Tikkun Olam. Okay, Eidim sign on the get because of Tikkun Olam, because maybe the Eidei Mesira will die. Maybe they'll go abroad and we won't be able to access them. And therefore we need something written on the get to be able to make sure that this woman can prove she's divorced. So what does he say here? A very fascinating line, very important opinion about how we understand Rabbi Elazar. We only allow the Eidei Chatima in a case where the Eidei Masira. If a woman comes and says, I want to get remarried, we ask her, prove that you're divorced. How does she prove it? Eidei Masira. She has to bring witnesses that saw the get. Only in the case where she can't, she can bring her get and look, here are the signatures. We rip up the get in general. So that's all another story. But that's a whole issue, a different thing. But let's just say there's signatures. We can go by the signatures. Okay, now, what's the big thing? He says, here come the big important words. De mistama behechsher nase. Why do we accept the witnesses? Not because this proves she was divorced. It doesn't prove at all that she was divorced. But what does he say? We can assume that if there's witnesses signed on this document, they wouldn't have signed unless he really gave her the get. So therefore, you can assume since there's witnesses signed, it proves that it was given mistama behechsher nase, that it must have been done properly. So witnesses wouldn't sign if they didn't know that it was going to be given over properly with Eidei Masira. So the witnesses that are there are not to prove that this was a valid get. It's to prove that the get was actually given in a valid manner. The fact that there's witnesses, Eidei Chatima, that helps prove the Eidei Masira. It's a unique approach because some people say, no, there's no Eidei Masira, so we'll rely on Eidei Chatima. That Rabbi Elazar is willing to go with both, really. This, right, one is ideal and one is less ideal. But he says, no. It's that the signatures actually prove that it was actually given. So that's like a proof that we actually had Eidei Masira. We just don't have them now. Anyway, that's an aside. If you didn't follow it all, it's okay. It's just an extra thing that I didn't want to ignore because it's super, one of these most important Tosfos, especially in Gittin, for this Masach. Okay. Now we're back to the Mishna. So the Mishna had said there's these two opinions about the Tanakh had said only from Medina Hayam, from abroad, which sounds like you're coming from a far place. Rabban Gamliel said even if you're coming from Rechem and Cheger, which are right on the border. And then Rabbi Elazar added even from Kfarludim to Lud. Lud is in Israel. Kfarludim is from out of Israel. They're very close to each other. We're going to see this. Question is, what's really the debate between them? So let's just quote the words here. Tanam Rabban Gamliel Omer Afa mivi min haRechem min haCheger. If you bring from those two places, Rabbi Elazar Omer Afilu mikfarludim lelod. So now comes Abai and explains this machloket about Kfarludim lelod. So Rabbi Elazar says you have to say b'fanai nechtam. Rabban Gamliel says you don't. Only from Rechem and Cheger. So what's the difference? Abai says, what's Kfarludim? It's a place that, on the one hand, is outside the borders of Israel. But the borders of Israel are not a straight, flat line. Okay, it's rounded. And within the borders of Israel, if you made a straight line, Kfarludim would actually be within the borders. Okay? If we made like a rounded line, let's say, or something like that, or a straight line. But the borders aren't straight. We know that, right? The borders are not straight lines. And therefore, Kfarludim is meaning, like, let's say, I don't know exactly how it works, but to the north and to the south, it's within the borders of Israel. Just the border of Israel is, let's say, to the west of it, and this is on the east side, right? So it's not within the border. Technically, it's outside the border. This happens with borders of countries all the time. They're not straight lines, okay? But it's surrounded by Israeli territory. So that's what their machloket is about. So Rabban Gamliel views this, that you don't need to say b'fanai nechtam, and Rabbi Elazar says you do. Soon we're going to see what exactly the debate between them is. So I saw this place. It's like the distance, he tries to give an example from their life in Babel. It's like the distance from here to there. Okay, a very short distance between Kfarludim to Lod. Now they say, Michlal de Tanakama Savar Hani Lod Sarich. It sounds like Tanakama doesn't mean not from Rechem and Cheger and not from Kfarludim and Lod. So now, my lav bahaka miflage. So now they're going to suggest what exactly is the debate. We can pull up the study guide again and see the options. So the first option is to say, Mar Savar Lefisha Ein B'Kiyim Lishma V'Hani Gemire. The first opinion, Tanakama says, oh, what's the whole issue? They have to know to be B'Kiyim Lishma, Raba and Hane Gemire. And the people in these places that are right near the border, they know the halacha because they live right next to Israel. But the Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar, who say no, the border or even the one that's, as long as it's outside the border, people don't generally cross the border. We know border crossings aren't so simple, and therefore it's not so common that people cross over the border, and therefore they're going to disagree. So now they're trying to say basically the machloket in the Mishna is the same as the machloket in Moraim later on in history between Raba and Rava. To which the Gemara is going to say, no, that's not true. Raba mitaretz l'tamei, the Rava mitaretz l'tamei. They each can explain it according to their logic. Raba mitaretz l'tamei. Again, Raba says it's all about b'kiyum l'shma. And then what's going to be the difference? I'm leaving the chart up here. Everybody agrees that's the issue. You have to say when people don't know the halacha of lishma. So here's the root of the machlok. Tanakama, who doesn't require in these places, he says, look, these people live nearby. They obviously know the halacha. Rabban Gamliel draws the line. He says, listen, the parts that are surrounded by territory of Israel on all sides, except for one, right? The border outside, like for Ludim, they know the halacha. But if you're next to it, like Rechem and Cheger, but you're outside the border and you're not muvla, you're not absorbed within, well, they don't know this halacha, right? Depends which place you live in. Rabbi Elazar says muvlaot also don't know this halacha, and not even if they don't really know the halacha, but shalot tachlok b'medinat hayam. We have to make a simple, clear line. Medinat hayam. Any place outside of Israel is not included. Okay, says it very simply. We're just not going to count anywhere outside of Israel. So as long as you're outside the border, you're going to have to say. Rava mitaretz l'tamei. Here comes Rava with his explanation. Everybody agrees it's all about the witnesses not being able to be found. V'tanakama, right? Our concern is we won't find the witnesses. So Tanakama saval, because they live right nearby, Rechem, Cheger, Praludim, so people go back and forth. Comes Rabban Gamliel, he says, Praludim lilod, people go very often back and forth. But Rechem, Cheger, people don't go very often. And after Rabbi Elazar, who needs it in all these cases, just like we said before, we don't want to distinguish between Medinat Hayam. So basically, we're going to say all the cases have to do it because anything that's considered outside the border is outside the border. None. Now we're moving to the next line of the Mishna. Look to the next chart on the second side of the study guide. The Mishna said, after it brought Rabbi Elazar, then there's this Chachamim's opinion. Only if you bring and bring back. Meaning, okay, now let's just go back. Tanakama said, you bring a get from abroad to Israel, you have to say it. But he didn't say if you go from Israel to abroad. Chachamim now, and then we had Rabbi Elazar, Rabban Gamliel. But then the Chachamim come and say, listen, you have to do it when you bring it, and you have to bring it if you bring a get back. In other words, if you're bringing a get from Israel to abroad, you also have to say it. So now they're going to say, Michlal, from here it seems to infer the fact that Chachamim say this later, but Tanakama never said this. The first, an attributed opinion, Michlal de Tanakama savar molichot tzarich. It sounds like Tanakama doesn't require from Israel to abroad. So now, what is the root of this debate? Ma'ila b'hakam miflagei sounds exactly like Raba and Rava again. Demar savar lefi she'en b'kiyum lishma v'hanei gmiri. One says, Tanakama says, what do you mean? They're not b'kiyum lishma, and these people in Israel know the halacha. So therefore, you don't have to bring when you're going from Israel to abroad. You don't have to bring it. Umar savar lefi she'en dimatzuyim l'kaimo v'hanei nami lo shchiche. And Chachamim say, what do you mean? It's because we're worried we're not going to find witnesses. And it doesn't matter Israel to abroad to Israel. In both cases, they live far away. You're not going to find witnesses. So now the Gemara is going to reject this and say, no. Rabbi mitaretz l'tamei v'Rava mitaretz l'tamei. Again, so we're doing the same thing we did in the previous. We tried to suggest that the machlokah between the three of them was based on Raba and Rava. And now we say the same. And then we said, no, each one can explain it according to their logic. And we're going to do the exact same thing here. So Rabba mitaretz l'tamei, de kule alma lefi she'en b'kiyum lishma. They both agree it's all about b'kiyum lishma, having to know this halacha. Now, in Israel, they know this halacha. So the big question is, why would Chachamim require you to do it in both directions, right? From Israel to abroad? Well, hacha b'gzerat molich atu mevi kamiflagei. The machlokah between them is, do we make a gzera and say, since you have to do it from abroad to Israel, then you have to do it from Israel to abroad, so that you don't accidentally think that you don't need to do it from abroad to Israel. So the Tanakama savar lo gazlina molich atu mevi. Tanakama says, no reason for gzera. The Rabbanan Batrai and the rabbis who come later in the Mishnah hold Gazrina molechatu mevi. You do make a gzera here, and that's the machloka between them. If you hold by Rava, if you hold by Rava mitaretz the tamei dekule alma lepisha eni dimetzuyim lekaima. And then, if it's all about edim, then really it should go in both directions. So how do we explain Tanakama who says it's only mevi and not molich? Well, we're going to explain it differently now. Rabbanan batrai leferushe tamei de Tanakama hu da'ate. According to Rava, when the rabbis say, Eino tzarich she'omar b'fanai nechtav ela ha'mevi mimidinat hayam ve'hamolich, what he's coming to say is, right, the only people that need to do this is one who brings it to abroad and brings it from abroad and brings it to abroad from Israel. And what's he trying to say? I'm explaining that first line of Tanakama. When he says hamevi get, what he means is hamevi ve'hamolich. He means both directions. And then there's actually no machloka between them. He's just explaining the other opinion. Okay, and that's a different way of resolving it and how we resolve it according to Rava. Tanan. Now we go to the next section of the Mishna. Hamevi get. Mi medina le medina b'medinat hayam. You bring a get within one country to another in Medinat Hayam, abroad, you have to say b'fanai nechta b'fanai nechta. Now, what can you infer from this statement? So we're going to have two ways of reading this statement. The first is to say, ha'b'otam medina b'medinat hayam lo tzarich. From here you can infer that within the same state in Medinat Hayam you don't need, because it only says medina le medina in Medinat Hayam. So this is only, now each time we make an inference, we're going to question one of the opinions. Le Rava nicha, to Rava this makes sense, because if you're within the same country, you can find the witnesses. If you're within a different country, you can't. But Le Rava kashi, Rava says the whole issue is lishma, shouldn't matter whether you're going from one country to another within the abroad countries. People abroad don't know the halacha. So lo tema, so now they say, okay, forget that inference. Don't say the inference is habotam dinam b'dinah hayam lo tzarich, that within that same country, in Medina Hayam, you don't need. Ela ema, what's the reference? It's not the inference. It's not maybe with the stress on Medina le Medina, but within Medina you don't. The stress is maybe Medina le Medina b'Medinat Hayam, one country to another in Medinat Hayam. But ela ema mi Medina le Medina be'eretz Yisrael lo tzarich. But from one country to another, again, maybe you call it state. From one, you'd have to define what's a Medina of Israel. But if you bring from one area, like let's say the Judea to the Galil, well, lo tzarich. Okay? In Israel, you don't need. And that fits perfectly with Rava, because in Israel, they know, right, it's all about lishma. So now they say, but you don't need this inference to tell you that, because habehedek katanela says it explicitly. What does it say? Hamevi get be'eretz Yisrael no tzarich lomar b'fanai nechtam b'fanai nechtam. Says explicitly in the Gemara, in the Mishna, that if you bring it in Israel, you don't have to say this at all. So you don't need the inference to tell you that. So then I say, no, you still do. If you just had a maybe get, you don't need to say it. But maybe that means you don't need to b'di'eved. But lechatchila, in an ideal sense, you still should. That's why this inference comes to tell you, no. It's only for Medina to Medina and other places, but Medina to Medina in Israel, you really don't need it at all. Some people read this whole sugya differently and said the question comes from a different inference. And we're going to start with the second inference this time rather than, right? Last time we started with the first and then we changed the inference. Now we're going to start with the second and then go back to the first. Some people question the following. Let's infer again. One country to another abroad, you have to say. Sounds like, but in Israel, from one area to another, you wouldn't need to. And now the difficulty is flipped. This works perfectly to Rava, who says the whole issue is lishma, because in Israel they know that halacha. But but for Rava, this is going to be difficult because what do you mean? Edim don't go back and forth all the time. You can't find them. To which the Gemara says, lo tema, forget that inference. Don't say it's Medina le Medina be'eretz Yisrael lo tzarich ela ema, but you should say ha ba'otam medina b'medinat hayam lo tzarich. Again, this is the reverse now. Go back to the first inference in the first section, which was, say that the inference is within the same country, Medinat Hayam, you don't need. In which case, right, that works with where our question was all with Rava. That works with Rava because within one country, you can find the witnesses very easily. But then what's the problem with that? The problem is, then go back to the other one that we rejected. What did we say? So now you want to say that within country to country or area to area in Israel, you do need, like Judea to Galil, you would need, according to Rava, because what's the problem? If the case is that any place you are, Medina le Medina, you would need to say b'fanai nefta b'fanai neftam, then the language of the Mishnah makes no sense. What did the Mishnah say? Medina le Medina in Medina Hayam. Litne hamevim Medina le Medina stam. It just should have said very simply in the Mishnah, anyone who brings from one country to another, right? Whether it's in Israel or whether it's in, right, or again, one state, one area. So now they say, so in the end, the inference that we said that it's Medina le Medina out abroad, but Medina le Medina in Israel doesn't need to be, you don't need to say it, is actually true. What was our question? It doesn't fit with Rava. How can we explain it fitting with Rava? Because remember, Rava said you won't be able to find witnesses. So why is it not a problem here to find witnesses in Israel from one area to another, like Judea to the Galil? Well, people are always going on Aliyah LaRegel. People travel the country all the time, and they go to Jerusalem, and people meet each other. You can always find the witnesses, right? It's pretty often that we see people around the country. To which the Gemara says, Tinach bizman shebeit hamikdash kayam. That only works when the temple is around and people are going on Aliyah LaRegel. But when the temple's not around and people don't go up on the holidays to the temple, well, how can you explain that people get around? To which they answer, because they have courts in different places throughout the country, people travel to go to the different courts. And therefore, it is a place where people are constantly traveling, whereas you don't have that necessarily abroad. And that's why Rav is not worried, even within one region of Israel to another. So now we've explained that according to both interpretations. Tonight, last section for, almost the last section, the last full section for today. Tonight, Mishna continues. Raman Shimon ben Gamliel omer, afilu mehagmonia lehagmonia. Okay, from one region to another, this is when there's a ruler in charge of one region and a different ruler in charge of another region. You also need to say, b'fanai nefta, b'fanai nefta. Va'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak said, Ir achat hayta be'eretz Yisrael, va'asisiot shma, asasiot shma. There was a place in Israel called Asasio. V'hayu ba shnei hagmoniyot, and there were two rulers in this town, or this area. Shayu makpidin zal zeh, and they wouldn't let people from this area go to the city, the other part of the city. Leficha hutzruchu lamar mehegmonia lehegmonia, and that's why they had to bring this part about hegmonia lehegmonia, because people couldn't travel from one to the other. Obviously, you know what they're going to do here. Le Rava nicha. This works perfectly with Rava because it's all about the Eidim, right? But le Rava kashya, but this was in Israel, so who cares if you can't go from one place to the other? You still don't need to say b'fanai nefta, b'fanai neftam, because we can assume you knew the halacha of lishma. Well, this is an actually really good question on Raba. And after all these situations where we're trying to question one opinion or the other, where we always come up with a resolution, they have no resolution here because it really seems to go against Raba. And it seems very clear that the issue is we need to have witnesses and we need to access the witnesses. And if they won't let people travel from one to the other, then we're not going to have any way to ever find the witnesses. To which you have to be sitting down and prepared for this. After all these few dapim about this Rava machloket, they now are pushed into a corner to say the following statement. Rabba itle de Rava. Rabba, who says the whole issue is lishma, also agrees with Rava that the issue is also witnesses. So in a case where it's not an issue of lishma, like for example, you're in Israel and they all know that halacha, you still will need b'fanai nefta, b'fanai neftam if there's an issue of not being able to find witnesses. In other words, he's going to agree that these are both issues. Where Rava thinks the only issue, Rava with an aleph thinks the only issue is Eidim Mitzuyim L'kaimo. Rava thinks they're both issues. So now the Gemara asks, Elamai benayu. So what's the difference between them if Rava agrees with Rava? Well, ikabenayu datu beitre. First example, there would be a nafkamina, a practical difference. If two people brought the get, two people bring the get from abroad, we now have these two people who can serve as witnesses about the veracity of this get. And then you wouldn't need to say b'fanai neftam if you're worried about witnesses. If you're worried, if they don't know the halacha, that the people who signed didn't know the halacha, and the people who wrote it didn't know this halacha of tiva lishma and chatima lishma, well, then you would need them to say it in any case. So Rava would say you need it, and Rabba with a hey would say you need it, and Rava with an aleph would say you don't need it. Inami bo tamidina b'midinat hayam. Likewise, if you're within the same country, abroad, or the same state area, then you wouldn't need, just because you're abroad, Rava wouldn't require you. But Raba, who says it's not just the witnesses, it's also, we have to make sure it was done lishma. Since they're abroad, we assume they don't know the halach of the shema, and you would have to say, b'fanei nefta, b'fanei nefta. Last line for today. If it says in our Mishnah, if you bring a get and you can't say b'fanei nefta, b'fanei nefta, what do? If there's witnesses, you can validate the witnesses, and the get can be validated based on that. So now they want to know, what does it mean you can't say? Why can't you say b'fanei nefta, b'fanei nefta? What's the issue? So we're going to suggest some things and try to figure that out in tomorrow's daf. Okay, quick review of today's daf. We started with figuring out who's the one who requires b'fanei nefta, both ktiva l'shma and chatima l'shma. And we tried to say which Amora is it. We tried to say Rabbi Meir, we rejected it, that maybe Rabbi Meir requires the ktiva on the writing of it, l'shma, on a rabbinic level. We rejected that. We said Rabbi Elazar it is. He requires it when there are witnesses that sign, it has to be l'shma. If you don't have witnesses, doesn't even need that. But if you do sign and it has to be right, that was one possibility. The second possibility was it was Rabbi Yehuda, which was a much simpler possibility because he actually disagrees with Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Meir requires both ktiva and chatima to be l'shma. And that was a much easier answer, and the Gemara had to explain why didn't we just say that in the first place. Then we went to understand the machlok at Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar, and the Tanakama about which places that are right on the border need to or not need to say b'fanei nefta, b'fanei nefta. We tried to suggest maybe the machlok is based on Raba and Rava. In the end, we explained both according to Raba and according to Rava what exactly their argument is about. We did the same thing with the rabbis in Tanakama about molich and mevi. Is it both molich and mevi, or is it just mevi get who has to say it? And do they really argue or not? That was a good question. First, we tried to say maybe they argue over Raba Rava. Then we said, no, Rava can explain it his way and Rava can explain it his way. And when we used Rava, we said in the end that they actually don't disagree. They both agree. Chachamim were just explaining Tanakama, although in the other explanation, they actually do disagree. Then we moved to an inference. And we had two ways of reading the sugya, of questioning Raba and Rava based on inferences from this one line about one country to another in Medinat Hayam. You have to say it, what was inferred from here, and does that raise difficulty against one of the opinions, and how do we work that out? And then we brought this Rabbi Shimon, the hegemonia, and raised a question against Rabba, and then basically had to put, we got stuck in a corner and had to say that Rabba actually thinks both of those things are issues. And we said, what's the practical difference between them? And then we were left with this question, what's the case in the Mishna where they say you can't say b'fanei nefta, b'fanei nefta? With that, we'll finish today's daf, wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.